The air was thick with fear. People walked down the streets of towns and villages, eyes darting from side to side, wondering who might be watching, who might be listening. In a world where speaking your mind could lead to unspeakable horrors, silence became a tool of survival. This was the reality for those who lived under the shadow of the Inquisition, an era where thinking differently, questioning the status quo, or even reading too much was enough to have you branded a heretic or worse. Imagine for a moment a book in your hand, perhaps one that questioned the divine authority of the Church or explored ideas that were deemed dangerous. To most of us today, it might seem like a simple act of curiosity. But in the time of the Inquisition, that very book could mean death. The Inquisition did not just target the practitioners of alternative religions, but also anyone who dared to question the teachings of the Church. Philosophers, scientists, artists, and even ordinary men and women who read too deeply, too widely, found themselves accused of heresy. And in a world where the written word was often the gateway to new ideas, the Church sought to control it, to suppress anything that might undermine its power. This wasn't just about books, it was about the very nature of thought itself. For those who dared to challenge the accepted norms of their time, the punishment was swift and brutal. The act of questioning the dogma of the Church wasn't seen as an intellectual pursuit. It was seen as a direct threat to the foundation of society. In the minds of the Inquisitors, any deviation from the prescribed beliefs was not only a sin, it was treason. As you reflect on the stories we've shared, think about the resilience, the courage, and the spirit that withstood even the darkest of times. It's a story that continues to inspire us today. If you found this journey into history captivating, don't miss out on what's to come. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we dive deeper into more incredible stories from the past. And hey, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? What time is it in your city? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the globe. I can't wait to hear from you. Now, think about the fear that gripped people's hearts as they tried to navigate this treacherous landscape. Neighbors, once trusted friends, could turn on you at any moment. It wasn't just about living in constant fear of the authorities, it was about the people around you. Accusations could come from anyone, a disgruntled neighbor, a jealous friend, or even a stranger with an axe to grind. In this environment, trust was a luxury most could not afford. Imagine the dread that must have settled over those accused, the sense of betrayal that came with being exposed by someone you thought you could rely on, and it didn't stop there. Once accused, there was no turning back. The machinery of the Inquisition was ruthless. Trials were a formality. The verdict was already decided the moment the accusation was made. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this system wasn't the public execution or the torture, it was the psychological toll it took on its victims. For many, the worst part of the Inquisition wasn't the pain they endured physically, but the toll it took on their minds. The long hours of questioning, the endless interrogations, and the constant threat of death or worse wore down their will to resist. In the cold, damp cells of the Inquisition's prisons, victims were broken not only physically, but emotionally as well. Many would confess to crimes they never committed, not because they were guilty, but because the pressure to conform, to repent, was unbearable. The true horror of the Inquisition wasn't just the torture, it was the manipulation of a person's very sense of self. The ability to break someone's spirit, to strip them of their identity and force them to betray their deepest convictions, was the true weapon of the Inquisitors. Even more terrifying was the certainty that once you were marked, there was no escape. Those accused were often forced to publicly denounce their beliefs, sometimes in front of crowds that gathered to witness the spectacle. They were paraded before the public, humiliated, and often sentenced to death. The punishment for heresy was not just a matter of execution, it was an obliteration of the person's soul. Being branded a heretic meant being erased from society's memory. In many ways, it was a fate worse than death. But who were these accused? Who were the ones who dared to stand up against the power of the Church? They were not all scholars or intellectuals, as we might imagine. Often, they were ordinary people, farmers, women, and children who simply asked too many questions. Women, in particular, were especially vulnerable. In a world where their roles were rigidly defined, any deviation from the norm was seen as a threat. A woman who was too independent, too outspoken, or too curious might be accused of witchcraft, and her fate was sealed. The Inquisition turned every woman into a suspect. For men, the danger was less immediate, but no less real. A man who challenged the dogma of the Church could find himself branded a heretic, but it was the women who bore the brunt of the Church's repression. They were the ones who were accused of witchcraft, of consorting with demons, of threatening the very foundation of Christian society. Women who were accused of heresy or witchcraft were often subjected to the most horrific forms of torture. They were burned at the stake, drowned, or worse. The images of women being tied to stakes, flames licking at their feet as they were consumed by fire, are some of the most haunting from this period. These women were not given the luxury of a fair trial. They were not given a chance to defend themselves. Their only crime was being different, being curious, or simply existing in a world that feared them. But for those who survived, for those who managed to escape the clutches of the Inquisition, there was no happy ending. Even if they were able to escape with their lives, they were marked for the rest of their existence. They lived in fear, knowing that at any moment the shadow of the Inquisition could return. The fear of being accused, the fear of being betrayed by someone you trusted, never truly left them. For many, the trauma of that time stayed with them for the rest of their lives, haunting their every step, casting a long shadow over their future. And yet, in the face of this unrelenting oppression, there were those who resisted. They resisted in quiet, subtle ways. They hid their beliefs, their books, their knowledge. They passed on forbidden knowledge in whispers in secret places, keeping the flame of intellectual freedom alive despite the odds. These were the unsung heroes, the ones who fought not with swords or fists, but with their minds, their courage, and their will to survive. Their stories are the ones we should remember, for they are the true symbols of resistance in a time when resistance was almost impossible. But for every hero, there were countless others who were lost. Lost to the flames, lost to the torture, lost to the darkness of the Inquisition's power. And in the end, what was the legacy of this period? What was the impact of a society that allowed such cruelty to flourish? The Inquisition left a scar on history, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of suppressing dissent. It was a time when fear ruled, when the truth was silenced, and when the human spirit was pushed to its limits. And it begs the question, how far have we truly come since then? The grip of the Inquisition, unrelenting and suffocating, extended far beyond the confines of the Church. It had become the very heartbeat of society, and fear coursed through every aspect of life. The terror wasn't limited to the individuals directly accused. It reached deep into families, into communities, and into the very essence of daily life. What was once a simple disagreement or a quiet deviation from the norm could quickly transform into an accusation that threatened to destroy not just one person, but entire families. And in a world where the line between loyalty and betrayal was as thin as a whisper, no one was safe. The Inquisition was a system built on secrecy and distrust. Accusations didn't need evidence, they only needed a whisper. The authorities didn't need to prove guilt. The community's word was enough to condemn someone to a fate worse than death. Imagine living in a place where your every movement was scrutinized, where your words could be twisted, where any slight could lead to the ruination of your life. Neighbors, once trusted friends, became strangers in the blink of an eye. A small disagreement, an argument over land, a dispute over an inheritance, these seemingly insignificant things could escalate into deadly accusations. It wasn't about the truth, it was about power, and power was held by those who could manipulate the system. A simple spat between neighbors could easily end in one of them standing in front of the Inquisitor, accused of heresy or witchcraft. The role of women in this horrifying drama was particularly brutal. Women were seen as inherently more vulnerable to the influence of the devil, according to the Church's teachings. This created an environment where women's behavior was constantly under scrutiny. A woman's beauty, her independence, her intellect, anything that deviated from the mold of what was considered proper, could lead to accusations of witchcraft. Women who were widowed or who didn't remarry quickly were often seen as dangerous. They were untethered, free from the traditional roles imposed by the Church and society, and thus perceived as threatening. In the town square, it wasn't uncommon to see women being dragged to the stake, tied and condemned for crimes they never committed. These women were often accused of conspiring with demons, of causing illnesses, of being the source of bad harvests or misfortunes. But they were never given a chance to defend themselves. The trial wasn't about seeking the truth. It was about reaffirming the power of the Church, about silencing those who threatened its authority. And for many women, the outcome was inevitable. They were to die, and it would be a public spectacle. Their suffering, their torment, was part of a greater narrative that justified the authority of the Church. But not all women faced the same fate. Some managed to escape the public executions and tortures. These women, often branded as witches or heretics, found themselves in exile, living in the shadows, always aware that at any moment the Inquisition could return to finish what they had started. For these women, survival was an act of defiance, a quiet resistance against an oppressive system that sought to erase their very existence. And yet, even within the horrors of the Inquisition, there were moments of incredible bravery and resilience. The sheer terror of the times might have led many to collapse under the weight of fear, but others fought back. They fought not with swords, but with their minds, with their courage, and with their will to survive. They resisted, sometimes in the smallest of ways. They hid books, they passed on forbidden knowledge, they found secret ways to challenge the narratives that sought to control them. They resisted, in their way, every time they dared to live differently. But these moments of resistance were fleeting. The Inquisition was a machine designed to grind down any who dared to challenge it, to consume them until nothing remained but submission. The idea of dissent was anathema to the Church's authority, and anyone who questioned it became a target. Whether through their writings, their speeches, or their actions, anyone who dared to express a thought outside the Church's teachings found themselves marked for persecution. The Inquisition didn't care about innocence. It cared only about maintaining the status quo, about ensuring that its version of the truth remained unchallenged. And in this pursuit, the Church employed some of the most grotesque forms of torture ever devised. But it wasn't just the physical pain that devastated its victims. The true terror of the Inquisition was the psychological toll it took on those who were accused. The constant fear of being betrayed, of being denounced by someone you trusted, of being dragged away in the dead of night. This was the true weapon of the Inquisitors. The torturers didn't need to extract confessions. They only needed to keep their victims in a state of constant fear. That fear alone was enough to break most people. For those who were tortured, the effects lasted long after the physical pain had subsided. Their bodies may have healed, but their minds remained scarred, haunted by the things they had seen, the things they had been forced to endure. Many were broken, not by the pain, but by the realization that they had been betrayed by those they loved and trusted. They had been abandoned by their families, by their friends, by their communities. In many ways, the psychological scars of the Inquisition were more lasting than the physical ones. And then there were those who didn't survive. The ones who never made it to trial, the ones who never had a chance to defend themselves. Some were burned at the stake, others were drowned. Still others were subjected to unspeakable acts of violence in the name of purging evil from the world. The bodies of these victims became the symbols of the Church's power, the reminders of what happened to those who dared to defy its teachings. But even in death, the Inquisition had a way of erasing its victims. The names of those executed, those tortured, those condemned were often wiped from history. In many cases, their families were forced into silence, their stories buried under the weight of fear and shame. For centuries, their suffering went unnoticed, their resistance unrecognized. Their stories were erased, their voices silenced in a world that had become deaf to the cries of its victims. Yet, for every person whose name was forgotten, there were those who continued to carry the flame of resistance. It might have been a whisper, a secret shared between a handful of people, but it was a flame nonetheless. And in time, this flame would burn brighter, pushing back against the darkness that had consumed so many. But that fight, that struggle for truth and freedom, was one that would take centuries to unfold. And so, as we look back on the horrors of the Inquisition, we are reminded not only of the suffering endured by its victims, but also of the incredible resilience that emerged from the ashes. In a world ruled by fear, there were those who stood up, who resisted, who refused to be silenced. Their courage, their strength, their defiance serves as a testament to the power of the human spirit in the face of tyranny. And though their stories may have been lost for a time, they are not forgotten. The Inquisition didn't only target the minds of individuals, it sought to dominate every aspect of life, embedding itself into the very structure of society. There was no part of daily existence that was immune from its reach. Every whisper, every look, every word spoken in public or private carried the potential to be twisted, misinterpreted, or turned into an accusation. Society itself was transformed into a living, breathing machine of fear, where betrayal was not just a possibility, but an expectation. Consider for a moment the depths of paranoia that would have gripped a community under such a regime. Neighbors, once friendly and familiar, became potential threats. Any small interaction could be spun into something sinister. A neighbor lending a hand with the harvest, perhaps a secret alliance with witches. A woman sitting alone in her garden gazing into the distance. Maybe she was communing with demons. The boundaries between ordinary life and the terrifying unknown became increasingly blurred, and people were forced to question their own relationships. What would have once been a friendly smile could now be interpreted as something more sinister, a gesture pregnant with hidden meaning. In a world where everything could be taken as evidence, even a fleeting moment of silence might spell the end. At the core of this ever-present threat were the accusations, often anonymous, that could be made at any time by anyone. The sheer ease with which one could be denounced was part of the insidious nature of the Inquisition's grip. No longer were people simply worried about their actions. They now had to fear the very people around them. An accusation could come from the most unlikely of sources, a jealous lover, an envious neighbor, or even a stranger with no real stake in the matter. People had to keep their heads down, their voices low, and their movements even quieter. The fear of being accused was worse than the fear of any torture, because the isolation it caused went beyond the individual. It spread through entire communities, breaking bonds that had taken years to build. The concept of confession was central to the Inquisition's power. The Church didn't merely seek to punish, it sought to extract admissions of guilt, often through violent means. Torture was not seen as cruel, but as a necessary method for saving the soul. It was, in the eyes of the Church, an act of mercy, a means of forcing the accused to repent, to confess their sins, and thereby save themselves from eternal damnation. And it was in this twisted logic that the Inquisition found much of its justification. Torture, however, was not merely a tool of punishment, it was a tool of psychological manipulation. The pain, the fear, the uncertainty, these all wore down the will of the accused, making them more likely to confess to crimes they had never committed. One can only imagine the mental and emotional toll on those who were caught in this cycle. The psychological scars were far deeper than the physical ones. Many of the accused were forced to endure the unimaginable pain of the rack, the breaking wheel, or the thumbscrew. These were not just methods of physical punishment. They were designed to break the spirit, to reduce a person to a shell of themselves, desperate for any form of relief, even if it meant confessing to something they had never done. The mental destruction was, in many ways, more terrifying than the physical pain, for it left victims not just scarred, but also silenced, their will to fight stripped away. For those who managed to survive the tortures, the aftermath was just as harrowing. Imagine being released from the grips of the Inquisition, only to find yourself marked for life. The stigma of having been accused was often enough to condemn a person to social exile. Their reputation, their standing in the community, was ruined. Even if they had been freed from charges, the suspicion never truly dissipated. They had been touched by the Inquisition, and that touch was permanent. This destruction of one's social standing was perhaps one of the cruelest aspects of the whole system. The accused were often left to live the rest of their lives in a kind of limbo, exiled from the very society that once embraced them. But beyond the personal suffering, the Inquisition's real power lay in its ability to shape and control society. Through fear and punishment, it redefined morality, subordinating it to the will of the Church. The lines between right and wrong became increasingly blurred, not because they were unclear, but because the Church demanded obedience over understanding. In a world ruled by the Inquisition, the pursuit of truth was secondary to the enforcement of conformity. The pursuit of knowledge itself was dangerous. Those who questioned, those who sought to understand more, were seen as threats to the established order. In a time when the written word was still the main source of knowledge, the mere act of possessing forbidden texts became a crime. Those who dared to read works that weren't approved by the Church risked their lives. Consider the fate of many intellectuals, scientists, and philosophers of the era. They were the ones whose ideas threatened the foundation of the Church's authority. Galileo, for example, was forced to recant his views on heliocentrism, not because his observations were wrong, but because they contradicted the Church's teachings. His punishment was not physical torture, but a public trial and the threat of excommunication, an ultimate form of spiritual damnation. His case exemplifies the true nature of the Inquisition. It was not about saving souls, but about controlling minds. The Inquisition's real enemy was not heresy. It was the free exchange of ideas. The Church's power over knowledge was not confined to the intellectual elite. It permeated all aspects of society. Even the simplest of people were subjected to this control. The common folk, with their limited access to knowledge, were often the most vulnerable. They lived in constant fear that any deviation from the norm, any expression of independent thought, could be seen as a sign of heresy. For them, it wasn't just about being accused. It was about living in a world where the very act of thinking could be deadly. The consequences were often far-reaching. Families were torn apart, friends betrayed one another, and entire communities were swept up in the tidal wave of accusations and trials. No one was immune from the suspicion that seeped into every corner of society. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Inquisition's reign was the betrayal it fostered. It wasn't just the formal torture of the accused. It was the quiet, insidious betrayal that came from neighbors, from family members, from people who could not escape the fear that pervaded every aspect of their lives. It was a system that forced people to choose between loyalty to their loved ones and loyalty to the Church. In a world where speaking up meant risking your own life, where silence often became a shield, betrayal became a survival mechanism. And in the end, even those who were innocent could not escape the stain of suspicion, for they had survived, often at the expense of someone else. But amidst this darkness, there were glimmers of defiance, in secret, in whispers. In the quietest corners of society, people resisted. They resisted not with weapons, but with their thoughts, their beliefs, their ability to preserve knowledge in the face of destruction. They passed on forbidden books. They kept their intellects sharp. They refused to be broken. In doing so, they ensured that the spirit of resistance lived on, even in the face of overwhelming fear. They may not have been able to openly defy the Inquisition, but in their quiet rebellion, they preserved a flame of hope that would one day grow into the Renaissance, a movement that would forever change the course of history. And so, even as the Inquisition consumed the lives of so many, it also sowed the seeds for a future where the light of knowledge could never again be so easily extinguished. The world may have been plunged into darkness, but within that darkness, the spark of defiance remained, waiting for its moment to rise again. And rise it did. But the price for that freedom was steep, and the scars left by the Inquisition would never truly heal. Under the unyielding weight of the Inquisition, the very fabric of personal freedom began to unravel. To question, to seek knowledge, to explore the world beyond the Church's narrow confines was to risk losing everything. In such an environment, the mere act of curiosity became a rebellious act. And yet, for those who dared to ask questions, the consequences were swift and brutal. But perhaps the most insidious cruelty of all was not the physical pain or even the public executions. It was the destruction of freedom itself, the denial of one's very existence. Imagine, for a moment, the sheer terror of being accused of heresy. To face the Inquisitors was not merely to be judged by your peers, it was to be judged by the ultimate authority, a force that was not only temporal but spiritual. The Church's power was not limited to earthly dominion. It reached into the afterlife, threatening eternal damnation to anyone who dared defy its teachings. To speak out against the dogma of the Church was to risk an eternity of suffering. The Inquisition promised not just physical punishment, but the eradication of your soul. This brutal framework of fear was at the core of the Inquisition's strength. It wasn't enough to punish the body. The Church sought to conquer the mind, to ensure that even the most rebellious thoughts could not take root. The idea of eternal damnation was a powerful tool, so powerful that it often led people to betray their own beliefs, their own families, and even themselves, in order to escape the threat of being eternally condemned. For those who faced the Inquisition's judgment, the process was agonizing in every way. It wasn't simply the horror of torture, but the terrifying psychological strain of knowing that one's fate rested not just in the hands of the authorities, but in the perceived judgment of God. The fear was omnipresent. There was no refuge from it. People knew that if they were accused, they would be stripped of their dignity. Their family would be torn apart, and their name would be permanently stained. Even if they survived the trial, the stigma of having been marked by the Inquisition would remain, forever casting a shadow over their lives. Consider the tortured soul of someone facing a trial for heresy. The accused often had no hope of proving their innocence. The process was rigged against them. The authorities didn't seek truth. They sought confession. The goal was not justice, but submission. The accused were often given no opportunity to defend themselves in any meaningful way. Instead, they were subjected to a relentless barrage of interrogation designed to break them down psychologically. The very nature of the process made it impossible for the accused to escape. Even if they were innocent, even if they had done nothing wrong, the torture and manipulation they endured led many to confess to things they had never even considered. The public confessions were often the most chilling part of the process. Once the accused had confessed, whether truthfully or not, they were paraded before crowds, humiliated and mocked. These confessions were seen not just as personal admissions of guilt, but as public declarations of the Church's power. The public spectacle of confession served as both punishment and warning, a chilling reminder to everyone else in the community that to question the Church was to risk becoming the next victim. In some cases, the accused were forced to walk through the streets, bound and shackled, in front of the very people who had once been their neighbors. Their families were often disowned, their reputations destroyed. The shame was often more unbearable than the physical pain, as the accused were left to wonder how their lives had been so completely overturned, how their very identities had been erased in the eyes of society. It wasn't just the punishment of the individual, it was the punishment of everyone they knew, the destruction of their entire social world. And then came the executions, the public burnings at the stake, the drownings, the tortures that left permanent marks on the bodies of the condemned. These were not just acts of punishment, but acts of power. The Inquisition's methods of execution were designed to make a statement, to create fear in the hearts of those who might consider questioning the established order. The public spectacle of death was a tool of psychological control, a reminder to the people that any deviation from the Church's teachings would result in the most horrific of consequences. For some, death was a mercy. The torture and the mental torment they faced were so great that the prospect of death was a relief. The physical pain was unbearable, but it was the emotional and psychological torment that was truly devastating. To live under the constant threat of execution, to live in a world where your every thought could be a crime, was to exist in a nightmare from which there was no escape. And so, for many, the end came as a release, an end to the fear, the suffering, the humiliation. But there were others who fought back. Not with weapons or open defiance, but with subtlety, with resistance in the smallest ways. These were the ones who survived the longest. They hid their beliefs, they passed on knowledge in secret, they refused to give in completely to the crushing weight of the Church's power. They whispered forbidden ideas to one another, they concealed heretical texts, they found small ways to defy the system. And though their resistance was often quiet and unnoticed, it was there, flickering in the darkness. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Inquisition was its ability to destroy the spirit of an entire community. The atmosphere of fear was so pervasive that it was impossible for anyone to truly escape its reach. The Inquisition turned people against one another, created divisions that lingered for centuries. Friends and family members betrayed each other in the name of survival. The very nature of social relationships was altered. People couldn't trust their neighbors. They couldn't even trust their own family members. They lived in a world where everyone was a potential enemy, and every relationship could turn into a battleground. And yet, for all the suffering it caused, for all the lives it destroyed, the Inquisition could not crush the human spirit entirely. It could suppress ideas, it could force conformity, it could intimidate people into silence, but it could not fully erase the desire for freedom, for knowledge, for truth. Even in the darkest corners of society, there were those who found ways to preserve the essence of their beliefs. The Inquisition may have silenced them temporarily, but it could not destroy them completely. For some, the Inquisition was the end of the road. They were silenced, their voices forever lost to history. But for others, the Inquisition was only a temporary setback. It may have crushed their bodies, it may have broken their spirits, but it never broke their desire for freedom. And over time, this resistance, this refusal to be completely subdued, would become the foundation for a new world, one where the pursuit of knowledge and the fight for freedom could never again be so easily extinguished. But this struggle, this fight for freedom, came at a high price. And as we reflect on the history of the Inquisition, we must remember the toll it took, not just on the individuals who were directly affected, but on society as a whole. The damage was not just physical, it was psychological, emotional, and cultural. It left scars that would take generations to heal, and some wounds are still felt today. In the end, the legacy of the Inquisition is a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the price of silence in the face of oppression. It's a reminder of the lengths to which people will go to preserve their control over others, and of the resilience of the human spirit, even when that control seems absolute. The Inquisition, with its pervasive and unyielding grip, altered the course of human history in ways that still echo in the present. It was not merely a series of trials, executions, and tortures. It was a system of control, a carefully constructed apparatus designed to stifle dissent, suppress knowledge, and maintain the power of a single, all-encompassing institution. Its effects were felt not only by those who stood accused, but by entire generations who lived in fear under the constant shadow of this ruthless machine. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Inquisition was its ability to distort the very concept of truth. In a time when the Church held absolute sway, there was no room for questioning its doctrines, no space for exploration outside its tightly held boundaries. The truth, as defined by the Church, became the only truth. To challenge it was to risk not just your life, but your soul. And so, people were forced to suppress their innermost thoughts, their curiosities, their sense of intellectual freedom. The Inquisition worked to ensure that knowledge, in all its forms, was a tightly controlled commodity, one that was carefully regulated by the clergy and the state. The books you read, the ideas you entertained, the questions you asked, all of these were dictated by the authorities. There was no room for independent thought. It is hard to imagine a world where curiosity could be a crime, where the pursuit of knowledge could lead to torture and death. Yet, for those who lived during the Inquisition, this was a reality. The stakes were high. To question the doctrines of the Church, even in the privacy of your own mind, was to place yourself in peril. The consequences were clear. If you were suspected of heresy or witchcraft, there was no mercy. Trials, interrogations, and torture awaited. But for many, even the idea of being accused was enough to drive them into silence, to compel them to conceal their thoughts, to keep their beliefs hidden. The fear of being betrayed by a friend or neighbor, the fear of being dragged into the nightmare of the Inquisition, was enough to quash any impulse to speak out. For some, the path to survival was submission. Those accused were often given a simple choice: confess, and you may be spared the worst of the torture. Deny, and face unimaginable pain. The act of confession became a tool of the Inquisition, not just for extracting guilt, but for forcing submission to the Church's absolute authority. The confessions were often coerced, extracted under duress, and frequently false. But in the eyes of the Church, confession was the first step to salvation, a means of cleansing the soul. For the accused, however, it was a desperate act of survival, a way to end the torment, to escape the horror of the trials. But even those who confessed were not guaranteed mercy. Confession did not absolve you from the final judgment. It did not save you from being burned at the stake or drowned in the name of God. And so, the Church's power was cemented in the minds of the people, not just through fear, but through the manipulation of their deepest emotions: guilt, shame, and doubt. The Inquisition didn't just seek to punish heretics and witches, it sought to make people doubt themselves, to make them question their own beliefs, their own worth. In the world of the Inquisition, no one was ever truly safe. Even those who were never accused, who lived their lives quietly and obediently, were never free from the knowledge that at any moment they could be targeted. The Inquisition turned society into a powder keg, where every disagreement, every whisper, every look could ignite a firestorm of suspicion. The Church's reach extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom and the torture chamber. It infiltrated the very structure of society. Family members turned against one another, neighbors betrayed neighbors, friends became enemies, trust was destroyed, and relationships were forever altered. This web of fear and suspicion extended deep into the heart of communities, fracturing families and friendships in ways that would take generations to heal. The most heartbreaking aspect of this process was the sense of isolation it created. Once you were accused, even falsely, you were marked for life. You were branded a heretic, a witch, a criminal. The stigma of accusation followed you wherever you went. often leaving you isolated, rejected, and alone. But not all were passive victims. Some, through sheer strength of will, resisted. They fought back, not with swords or violence, but with quiet acts of defiance, the small, subtle acts of rebellion that, over time, would form the foundation of a more open and free society. Books were hidden, and knowledge was passed in secret. Forbidden ideas were exchanged in whispers, passed from one person to another in the darkest corners of the world. These small acts of resistance, though seemingly insignificant in the moment, played a crucial role in the survival of knowledge and intellectual freedom. However, the Inquisition's grasp was so strong, its hold so pervasive, that even these small acts of resistance were dangerous. The authorities knew that the smallest spark of rebellion could ignite a firestorm of change, and so they worked tirelessly to stamp out even the slightest challenge to their authority. The threat of torture, the promise of death, loomed over every individual, every family. People had to make impossible choices, to resist and face death, or to submit and live in fear. It is important to understand that the Inquisition wasn't just a singular event in history. It was a symptom of a larger issue, a reflection of the broader societal structures that enabled such an atrocity to occur. The Inquisition was the result of centuries of religious and political power being concentrated in the hands of a single institution. The Church, with its divine mandate and its control over spiritual and temporal matters, was virtually untouchable. The power of the Church was so entrenched that to challenge it was not just an act of defiance. It was an act of rebellion against the very fabric of society. And so the Inquisition became the tool through which this power was maintained, a tool used to suppress not only heresy, but any form of dissent. The very nature of the Inquisition reflected the culture of the time, one that placed absolute faith in authority and power. It was an era in which the state and the church were one and the same, and in which the people had little say in how they were governed. In this world, power was absolute, and resistance was futile. The Inquisition was not just a religious institution, it was a political one, a force designed to maintain order, to control the masses, and to keep the power firmly in the hands of the elite. And yet, despite its power, despite its ability to control minds and bodies, the Inquisition was not invincible. It might have crushed many, but it also sowed the seeds of rebellion. Over time, as the years went by, people began to question the methods and the motives of the Church. They began to wonder whether the price of obedience was too high, whether the cost of submission was too great. It was in the aftermath of the Inquisition that the seeds of the Enlightenment began to sprout, ideas of reason, of free thought, of individual liberty. The legacy of the Inquisition is not just one of fear and oppression, it is also one of resilience and survival. For all the lives it destroyed, for all the communities it fractured, it also laid the groundwork for change. The lessons of the Inquisition, of the dangers of absolute power, of the consequences of unchecked authority are still relevant today. In a world where power still seeks to suppress dissent, where truth is still manipulated for the sake of control, the story of the Inquisition serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of intellectual freedom, of the need to question authority, and of the resilience of the human spirit. The fight for knowledge, for truth, for freedom, is not one that can ever be fully extinguished. The Inquisition may have silenced many, but it could never fully erase the desire for liberty. And in the end, that desire would be the force that would eventually tear down the walls of tyranny and bring light to a world that had been long in the dark. The passage of time during the Inquisition was marked not only by the brutality of its judgments, but by the societal transformations that came with the rise of such an oppressive regime. It was not enough for the Church to merely execute those who challenged its dogma. It sought to leave a permanent imprint on the culture, shaping it in a way that would make dissent nearly impossible. The Inquisition didn't just force obedience, it reshaped the very structures of society, making any form of rebellion feel unnatural, even immoral. One of the most profound impacts of the Inquisition was the way it altered the relationship between individuals and the state. In a time when religion and politics were inseparable, personal beliefs became a matter of public concern. It was not just the accused who suffered under the weight of suspicion, but entire communities that were forever transformed by the fear of betrayal. Neighbors no longer greeted one another with trust, but with a cautious eye, wary of the potential for any small disagreement to escalate into something far more dangerous. The nature of accusation itself became a weapon. In a world where faith was paramount, the mere suggestion that someone had strayed from the Church's teachings could lead to devastating consequences. And these accusations weren't limited to public actions or words. They could be based on the most trivial of things. A neighbor's disapproving glance, a whispered word, or a perceived slight could lead to an accusation of heresy, witchcraft, or treason. It was a system built on paranoia, where the line between justice and cruelty was hopelessly blurred. Consider the story of one of the many who fell victim to this system. A simple farmer from a small village who dared question the Church's authority over matters of life and death. His crime? Speaking out against the Church's control of local charities. To him, it seemed a reasonable point. Why should the Church control the distribution of food and shelter? Why should the poor be forced to bow before the church's representatives before receiving aid? It was an innocuous complaint, but in a world where the church held the keys to both spiritual salvation and physical survival, such words were dangerous. A few days after his outburst, a whisper spread through the village. Someone overheard his words, and before long, the accusation was made. He was denounced for heresy, for questioning the very foundation of the church's power. His trial was swift, an interrogation meant to break his will and force him into submission. The farmer, frightened and confused, was subjected to days of brutal questioning. His body was bruised, his mind fractured by the fear of eternal damnation. Eventually, he confessed not to the crime he had committed, but to something far worse, his inability to submit to the will of the church. His confession was not one of truth, but of survival. It was the confession of a man who had been broken by the machinery of the Inquisition. It was not the act of a sinner, but of a man too terrified to stand his ground. His family watched helplessly as he was led to the stake, his life extinguished in a burst of flames, his name forever marred by the charge of heresy. This was not an isolated incident. It was the fate of thousands. The question arises, how did such a system become so ingrained in society? How did a community, once based on trust and mutual respect, come to accept a reality in which betrayal became the norm? The answer lies in the way the Inquisition infiltrated not only the legal system, but the very psyche of society. The church did not simply punish, it sought to fundamentally alter how people thought, how they acted, and how they saw themselves in relation to others. The fear it generated became a part of daily life, shaping not only public behavior, but also private beliefs. The fear of the Inquisition was not just fear of physical pain, it was fear of being marked as an outsider, as someone beyond the pale of society. In the eyes of the church, to be accused of heresy was to be cast out of God's grace, to lose one's soul forever. In a world where eternal salvation was the ultimate goal, this was the most terrifying prospect of all. It wasn't just the threat of execution that loomed over people's heads. It was the fear of being severed from God and community. The Inquisition didn't just target bodies, it targeted the very souls of those it condemned, twisting faith and fear into a tool of control. The execution of heretics was not only a means of punishment, but a public spectacle, designed to reinforce the authority of the church. The stakes were high, and the executions were theatrical. They weren't simply about killing, they were about sending a message to anyone who might dare question the church's power. The flames of the burning stakes were a symbol of divine retribution, a sign that the wrath of God would descend on those who defied his will. It was a message of fear, one that spread quickly through the communities. The public executions were meant to be more than a demonstration of power. They were meant to instill a deep, unshakable fear in the hearts of the population. The very act of watching someone die in such a horrific manner was designed to remind people of the dangers of disobedience. But despite the terror it wrought, the Inquisition could not completely silence all dissent. In the darkest corners of society, there were those who still resisted, who still fought to preserve knowledge and freedom of thought. They did not rise up in violent revolt, but in small, quiet acts of rebellion. Books were hidden, and forbidden knowledge was passed along in secret from one person to another until it reached a critical mass. There were still some who risked their lives to teach, to share the ideas that the church sought to suppress. They did this, not in grand demonstrations, but in quiet acts of defiance, knowing full well the dangers they faced. Take, for example, the story of a scholar living under the weight of the Inquisition. He was a man of great learning, a man who had spent his life studying the works of the great philosophers and scientists. His knowledge was vast, and he had learned to see beyond the limited teachings of the church. He knew that the earth was not the center of the universe, that the heavens were not ruled by a divine being in the way the church had taught for centuries. But to speak these ideas aloud would be to risk everything, to risk his life, his family's future, and the lives of those who dared listen to him. So, he kept his knowledge hidden, his books locked away in the dark corners of his study. He passed on his teachings in secret, sharing his discoveries with only a trusted few. And though his work was not recognized in his time, it became a foundation for future generations. His quiet rebellion, his refusal to be silenced, contributed to the eventual unraveling of the church's grip on knowledge. The Inquisition could burn books, imprison scholars, and execute heretics, but it could not completely erase the thirst for knowledge that had already taken root. This quiet rebellion, hidden beneath the surface of society, played a crucial role in the eventual overthrow of the Inquisition's power. Over time, as more people began to question the established order, as more scholars and intellectuals began to push the boundaries of accepted knowledge, the church's authority began to wane. The seeds of the Enlightenment had been planted in secret, watered by the courage of those who refused to bow to tyranny. And though it would take centuries for these seeds to fully sprout, the Inquisition had inadvertently set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately change the world. The legacy of the Inquisition is a complex one. It is a legacy of fear, of cruelty, and of suffering. But it is also a legacy of resistance, of courage, and of hope. The darkness that it cast over the world could not extinguish the light of knowledge and freedom. And though many lives were lost and many voices silenced, the Inquisition could not completely erase the desire for truth and liberty. In the end, it was this desire, this unquenchable thirst for understanding, that would eventually lead to the birth of a new era, an era where the pursuit of knowledge was no longer a crime but a virtue. The Inquisition's power was not merely built on the fiery executions or the physical torture. It was constructed from fear, suspicion, and betrayal. This machine of control was finely tuned over centuries to create an environment where the act of thinking differently, of questioning, or even imagining a world outside the Church's teachings could get you killed. It wasn't simply that the accused were made to suffer physically. The entire structure of society, from families to communities, was dragged into a vicious cycle of paranoia. The very relationships people once held dear were torn asunder by suspicion. Imagine the mental toll on someone who found themselves accused. Imagine the isolation of knowing that even the slightest misstep, an innocent word, a fleeting thought, could bring the Inquisition's wrath upon you. For most, it wasn't even the physical pain that was the hardest to bear. It was the gradual unraveling of their dignity, their humanity. And yet, even those who survived the trials and torture found themselves permanently marked by the experience. The shame of being branded as a heretic or witch didn't wash away with a reprieve. It lingered like a shadow, haunting them long after their physical torment had ended. But the psychological toll was not just reserved for the accused. The Inquisition worked its poison into the fabric of society, destroying the trust that once held people together. Families began to fracture as children turned on their parents. Friends denounced one another and neighbors became suspicious of the smallest actions. This was the true horror of the Inquisition. It wasn't just about silencing dissent. It was about turning people against each other, creating a world where even the most intimate relationships were no longer safe. Imagine being a parent, watching your own child grow distant, wondering whether they would betray you for the sake of survival. Imagine being a spouse, constantly fearing that your partner might secretly turn you in to save their own life. The constant strain of living in such an environment, where every word you spoke could be twisted against you, eroded the very sense of community that had once existed. And it wasn't just the personal relationships that were affected. The entire social order was warped. The very notion of justice, of fairness, was obliterated. Trials, which should have been an opportunity to seek truth, became nothing more than an instrument of control. The truth itself was irrelevant. The aim of the trial was not to uncover the facts, but to enforce the will of the Church. Those who were accused were already guilty in the eyes of the inquisitors. What mattered was not whether they were guilty of the charge, but whether they would confess. The Inquisition wasn't in the business of administering justice. It was in the business of ensuring complete submission. The mechanisms of this system were as chilling as they were efficient. The accused were often tortured until they confessed, even if they had not committed the crimes they were accused of. Once they confessed, they were often forced to recant and accept the Church's authority. The confession became the Church's tool for demonstrating its power, for showing the world that it could bend any will to its command. But what was worse was the guilt that plagued those who confessed falsely. For many, the pain of being tortured into confession wasn't the worst part. It was the knowledge that they had betrayed their own beliefs, that they had given up their integrity to save themselves. For them, even survival became a kind of death. The consequences of their false confessions lingered in their hearts long after the physical pain had healed. The power of the Inquisition lay in its ability to make people believe that it was not just the authorities who could punish. They themselves were the ones responsible for the suffering. The Inquisition encouraged self-policing. People began to look over their shoulders, to question their own thoughts, to wonder whether their inner convictions would eventually be their downfall. Those who conformed the most often did so out of fear. They had been conditioned to believe that to challenge the status quo, to entertain a thought that strayed from the Church's teachings, was dangerous. This sense of fear permeated every corner of society. Even the simplest of actions became fraught with danger. To read an unapproved book could be an act of defiance. To ask a question could be seen as a challenge to divine authority. The result was an entire society that had been beaten into submission, a world where the very act of thinking independently became an act of rebellion. The Church's control over knowledge was one of its greatest sources of power. Books, texts, and ideas that had once flourished were now forbidden. The printing press, which had given birth to an intellectual revolution in other parts of Europe, was rendered useless if its products contradicted the Church's teachings. Those who sought knowledge outside the confines of the approved texts risked everything. Scientists, philosophers, and intellectuals who dared to step outside the bounds of the Church's narrow worldview were targeted, often accused of heresy or witchcraft. Their ideas were not just attacked, they were erased. The Church had a monopoly on knowledge, and it intended to keep it that way. But even in the darkness of the Inquisition, there were glimmers of resistance. Even as entire communities were torn apart by suspicion, there were those who fought in quiet, subtle ways. They hid their books, passed on forbidden knowledge in hushed tones, and resisted the pressure to conform. These acts of defiance were small, but they were powerful. They planted the seeds of change which would eventually take root in later generations. The Inquisition may have silenced many voices, but it could not silence the human spirit forever. For those who dared to think differently, for those who refused to conform, their ideas would eventually find a way to survive. Perhaps the most fascinating example of this quiet rebellion lies in the works of intellectuals who, despite the best efforts of the Church, managed to preserve their ideas for future generations. Take, for example, the work of Renaissance scientists like Copernicus and Galileo. They challenged the very foundations of the Church's teachings, and for their trouble they faced persecution, trial, and condemnation. But their ideas, once forced into the shadows, eventually ignited a revolution of thought that forever changed the world. The very fact that their work survived the Inquisition, despite the best efforts to suppress it, is a testament to the resilience of intellectual freedom. And the story doesn't end there. The Inquisition's power may have waned over time, but its legacy lived on in the structures it left behind. The Church's hold on knowledge, on society, on truth, continued to shape the world for centuries. But as the darkness of the Inquisition slowly faded, the light of intellectual freedom began to grow. The voices that had once been silenced began to speak again, and with each new voice, with each new idea, the walls of tyranny began to crumble. The Inquisition had tried to stamp out knowledge, to destroy curiosity, to force conformity, but in the end, it only set the stage for a new era of intellectual exploration. This battle between suppression and liberation continues to this day. Though the Inquisition may have ended, its legacy remains. We live in a world where knowledge is still a battleground, where those who question the status quo are often labeled as threats. And so, as we reflect on the story of the Inquisition, we're reminded of the importance of safeguarding the freedom to think, to question, and to learn. The price of intellectual freedom is high, but the rewards are even greater. And as long as we continue to fight for our right to ask questions, to seek knowledge, the spirit of resistance that began in the darkest days of the Inquisition will never truly die. The Inquisition, in its merciless pursuit of ideological and spiritual purity, sought not only to punish, but to transform society itself. It was a tool of power, a mechanism for reinforcing authority, and for creating a world where fear ruled every aspect of daily life. It was not enough for the Church to simply maintain control over doctrine. It aimed to govern thought, to shape hearts and minds in ways that stretched far beyond the confines of religious teachings. In a world where the very act of thinking differently was considered an act of defiance, the consequences of even a whisper of resistance were dire. At the heart of this transformation was the destruction of one of society's most fundamental bonds, trust. It wasn't just that the Inquisition sought to control knowledge, it sought to control relationships, to manipulate the very fabric of personal and communal life. The most devastating aspect of this was not the physical suffering of the accused. It was the complete erosion of trust among people. Friends, families, and neighbors, once allies in a shared community, became potential betrayers, always looking over their shoulders, wondering if the person next to them might be the one to accuse them. Imagine the terror of being caught in a system like this, to be a part of a community that once embraced you, to share a history, a language, a bond, and then to be thrust into a situation where that same community could turn on you without warning. Even the closest relationships were not immune from the reach of the Inquisition. A husband could betray his wife, a parent could denounce a child, and siblings could become enemies in an instant. The fear of being accused became so all-consuming that the very concept of loyalty and love began to unravel. Take, for example, the story of a young woman named Marguerite, a mother of two living in a small village. She had always lived quietly, tending to her family and her farm. But one day, after a heated argument with her husband over the treatment of a neighbor's sick child, she was overheard saying, "If God is so merciful, why does he let us suffer?" The words were spoken in frustration, the way many people might question their fate during difficult times. But in a world governed by the iron fist of the Church, these words were enough to mark her as a heretic. The very next day, the village's parish priest, an ambitious man eager to prove his devotion to the Inquisition, overheard the conversation. To him, Marguerite's words were an affront to divine providence. It didn't matter that her frustration came from a place of deep grief and confusion. Her words were dangerous. Without hesitation, he reported her to the local authorities. A few days later, Marguerite was arrested in front of her children, and her life was turned upside down. She was accused of questioning the will of God, of being a potential witch, perhaps even possessed. Her family was torn apart, as her children were taken into the custody of the Church, and her husband was forced to stand by, powerless, as the life they once knew crumbled before them. Marguerite's trial was swift. She was interrogated, forced to endure days of torture, and despite her eventual confession, her fate was sealed. She was burned at the stake in the village square. Her execution becoming a public spectacle meant to send a chilling message to everyone in the town. Her words, her pain, her very humanity were reduced to nothing more than a lesson for the others. To question was to risk everything. The village that had once embraced her as one of their own was left with a haunting reminder that even the smallest deviation from the norm could lead to death. Her family, forever scarred by the experience, could never fully recover. Her children were left with the weight of a mother's death, and her husband would forever carry the burden of knowing he had not saved her. But the Inquisition's greatest weapon wasn't the torture it inflicted on bodies. It was the manipulation of the human psyche. Through its relentless pursuit of conformity, it shattered not just the lives of the accused, but the very concept of self. In a world where people were taught to distrust their own thoughts, where their every word was scrutinized, even the most basic sense of identity was compromised. People no longer saw themselves as individuals. They saw themselves as potential criminals, as heretics, as witches. Their very existence became a reflection of the Church's power. One of the most insidious aspects of this system was the way it stripped individuals of their agency. In a world where the Church had absolute control over both the spiritual and the physical realms, people had no choice but to comply. The Church dictated the parameters of every aspect of life: marriage, family, health, and even how individuals should think. The idea of free will, the notion that a person could act on their own conscience or beliefs, was virtually erased. The Inquisition worked to ensure that people saw themselves only through the lens of the Church's judgment. The voice of the individual was drowned out by the power of the institution. The trials were not just about seeking justice or uncovering truth. They were a tool to control society itself. Every public confession, every denunciation, was designed to remind the community of the consequences of defiance. Each trial, no matter how small, was a reminder of the Church's absolute authority and the price that could be paid for questioning it. The Inquisition's grip spread far beyond the trial itself. It seeped into every facet of life, from the food people ate to the books they read, from the language they used to the way they interacted with one another. This created a society where the very idea of privacy was a distant memory. There was no private space where a person could think freely, where they could entertain their own beliefs without the fear of being accused. Every conversation was a potential trap. Every moment of silence was a potential confession. People didn't just fear the authorities, they feared each other. In the towns and villages across Europe, the bond of trust that once held communities together had been replaced by a web of fear and suspicion. And it wasn't just in the streets or the homes that the fear was felt. It was in the very institutions that were supposed to offer refuge: the church, the court, the family. In every place where people sought comfort or support, they found instead an ever-watchful eye. The Church had not only become a moral authority, it had become a political one. It held the power to control every aspect of life, to dictate what was right and wrong, and to determine the fate of every individual. It was a system where power flowed only in one direction, where the few controlled the many, and where the suffering of the individual was a small price to pay for maintaining order. But even in this oppressive system, there were cracks. The more the Inquisition spread, the more resistance it sparked. People began to question the very system that had so thoroughly dominated their lives. They began to see through the Church's facade of moral righteousness, to recognize that it was, in fact, a system of control designed to protect the interests of the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. One of the most significant acts of resistance was not public but subtle. Quiet whispers passed from one generation to the next, forbidden books hidden in the corners of homes, old texts preserved in secret. People still dared to think, they still dared to dream. And though they may have been silenced for a time, their ideas would eventually rise again, like embers waiting for the right moment to ignite. The Inquisition, despite its immense power, could never fully quench the thirst for knowledge, for freedom, for self-expression. This quiet rebellion would eventually lead to the end of the Inquisition. The seeds of intellectual and political change were already taking root, and the days of fear, suspicion, and control were numbered. The Inquisition may have crushed many lives, but it could not crush the human spirit. And in the end, it was the unbreakable will of the human heart, the desire for truth and freedom, that would forever change the course of history. As we look back on this dark chapter, we are reminded of the dangers of absolute power, the importance of questioning authority, and the resilience of those who dare to think for themselves. The legacy of the Inquisition is a powerful reminder that even in the face of the greatest oppression, the human spirit can never be completely extinguished. The relentless grip of the Inquisition was not just felt in the bloodied courts of trial or in the charred remains of those burned at the stake. It permeated the very way people lived their lives, reshaping the fabric of society in ways that we often overlook today. At the core of this systematic oppression was a single powerful concept: control. The Inquisition was not only about the eradication of heresy or the punishment of those who defied the Church's authority, it was about ensuring that the masses conformed, not just in outward actions, but in their hearts and minds. It was about instilling such a deep-seated fear of divine wrath and mortal punishment that even thinking differently became an unimaginable act of rebellion. In such a world, even the slightest deviation from the prescribed norms could be disastrous. Those who had been accused of heresy or witchcraft did not just face the horrors of trial and torture. Their entire lives were forever altered. Reputation, once a foundation of social standing, was tarnished beyond repair. A simple accusation, often fueled by jealousy or malice, could destroy not only the individual, but their family, their relationships, and their place in the community. For the rest of society, this created a chilling reality where safety could only be found in silence and submission, and the simplest act of defiance, an unguarded question, a whispered opinion, could be the catalyst for ruin. The Inquisition's influence went beyond the individual. It seeped into the very structures of society, turning everything into a mechanism of surveillance. One of the most tragic aspects of this period was the way it weaponized relationships. Neighbors, once trusted companions in the shared experience of life, became potential betrayers, each word spoken, each glance exchanged, pregnant with the threat of denunciation. It was not enough for the authorities to simply suppress dissent. They worked to turn friends into enemies, to make trust a liability, to destroy the foundation of the very communities that once provided solace and security. Take, for example, the case of a small village nestled deep within the Spanish countryside. The village, isolated and peaceful, had always been governed by its traditions. Families lived in tight-knit units, and the elders had a significant role in guiding the younger generations. Life moved slowly, marked by the rhythms of farming, religious festivals, and the occasional dispute over land. But all that changed one fateful day when a woman, Magdalena, stood up in the village square and dared to question the priest's sermon on the sacrament of confession. Her question was simple. If God is all-knowing, why does he need us to confess our sins? What seemed to Magdalena like an innocent, intellectual query was seen by others as an affront to the church's authority. The priest, eager to prove his devotion to the Inquisition, reported her to the local authorities. Magdalena was swiftly arrested, her life and the lives of her family irrevocably altered. The village that had once embraced her as one of their own was now torn between fear and suspicion. Her friends, terrified of being implicated in her heresy, withdrew from her. Neighbors who had once shared bread with her now eyed her with distrust. Even her children, once beloved by their classmates, were shunned. Her trial was a formality. The accusations were stacked against her, and there was no defense. Under the pressure of torture, Magdalena eventually confessed, not to the crime of heresy, but to the crime of defying the church's authority. Her confession, though made under duress, was enough to condemn her. She was burned at the stake in front of the entire village, a grotesque spectacle meant not only to punish her, but to send a clear message to everyone else. To question, to challenge, to think differently was a crime worthy of death. But the true tragedy of Magdalena's fate was not just her death. It was the destruction of her community. In the wake of her execution, the village was left in a state of fearful disarray. Relationships that had been forged over decades were now poisoned by doubt. No one dared speak freely, no one dared ask questions. Fear of being accused, fear of being implicated in some way, silenced the voices that had once been a source of strength and support. The memory of Magdalena, once a vibrant member of the community, was twisted into a cautionary tale. And though her body was consumed by fire, the flames of suspicion and distrust lingered long after. The Inquisition's ability to manipulate social structures in this way was one of its most powerful tools. It didn't just control the thoughts of individuals. It controlled the very fabric of society, ensuring that even the act of friendship could become an act of betrayal. And it wasn't just the accused who suffered. The guilt of turning someone in, of betraying a friend, a family member, or a neighbor, was a weight that many could not escape. In many ways, the real power of the Inquisition lay not in the fear of torture or execution, but in its ability to make everyone complicit in its reign. By making betrayal seem like a necessary survival tactic, the Inquisition forced people to live in a constant state of moral confusion. What had once been simple relationships, those between friends, family, and neighbors, were now tainted with suspicion. This manipulation of social dynamics didn't stop at the level of the individual. It extended to entire communities, entire regions. In the wake of the Inquisition, entire towns were left in a state of psychological disarray, unsure of who to trust or where to turn. The Church, with its all-encompassing power, had made sure that no one was ever truly safe. And even as the flames of the stake were extinguished, the fire of fear continued to burn within the hearts of the people. For years after the Inquisition's official end, communities continued to be haunted by the fear of retribution. The trauma of those who had been accused lingered in the collective memory passed down through generations. The stories of betrayal, of broken families, of lives destroyed, were woven into the cultural fabric of Europe, a dark reminder of what had once been. But even in the darkest corners of this period, there was resistance. There were those who refused to let the fear and the mistrust completely consume them. The whispers of defiance, though faint, began to grow. Small acts of rebellion, like hidden books, underground networks of intellectuals, and secret gatherings of those who still believed in the power of free thought, began to surface. These quiet rebellions, though often short-lived, played a crucial role in laying the groundwork for the eventual overthrow of the Inquisition's power. The Enlightenment, which would eventually emerge as a powerful intellectual movement, was in many ways a direct response to the horrors of the Inquisition. It was a reaction to the centuries of intellectual suppression, a call for freedom of thought, for the right to question, to reason, and to explore new ideas without fear of punishment. The thinkers of the Enlightenment, men and women who had lived through the shadow of the Inquisition, understood the profound cost of intellectual freedom, and they fought to ensure that the lessons of the past would not be forgotten. In the end, the legacy of the Inquisition is a paradox. On one hand, it represents the darkest impulses of humanity, the desire for absolute control, the willingness to sacrifice lives for the sake of power, and the willingness to suppress knowledge and truth in favor of conformity. But on the other hand, it also represents the resilience of the human spirit, the unbreakable will of those who refuse to accept tyranny, who risked everything for the sake of freedom and intellectual discovery. The story of the Inquisition is one of suffering, but it is also one of defiance. It is a story of how the human spirit, even when crushed under the weight of oppression, finds a way to fight back. Though the Inquisition may have silenced many voices, it could not extinguish the flame of intellectual curiosity. And as we reflect on this period of history, we are reminded that the fight for freedom, for knowledge, and for truth is not one that can ever be fully extinguished, no matter how many times it is suppressed. The lessons of the Inquisition continue to resonate today, a warning that the pursuit of power must always be tempered by the respect for human dignity, intellectual freedom, and the right to think, question, and believe freely. The reign of the Inquisition stretched far beyond mere physical suffering. It was a silent killer, shaping lives and communities in insidious ways that few could escape. Though the flames of the pyre may have consumed bodies, it was the longer-lasting effects, the psychological and emotional scars, that truly defined the devastation wrought by this dark period. The Inquisition's impact wasn't simply in the victims it directly destroyed, it was in the pervasive climate of fear and distrust it created, a climate that seeped into every corner of society. In every corner of Europe, people lived under the ever-present threat of being accused. The horror was not only in the public trials, but in the private spaces, the corners of homes, the shared meals, the quiet whispers among neighbors. The idea that anyone could be a traitor, a heretic, a witch, became so deeply ingrained that people began to turn on one another without hesitation. Loyalty became a commodity, bought and sold for survival. The concept of community was fundamentally altered, no longer a place of shared support, but a battleground of suspicion. And at the heart of this betrayal was a paradox. Those who would speak out against injustice were silenced, not by direct force, but by the overwhelming pressure to conform. Consider the story of a man named Thomas, a simple craftsman who lived with his family in a small town in southern France. His life, once predictable and peaceful, became irreversibly marked by the arrival of the Inquisitors in his village. Thomas had never been particularly religious. His beliefs were a quiet reflection of the traditions around him. But when the Inquisitors came, their very presence sent ripples of terror through the town. They brought with them not just their religious authority, but the threat of punishment for anyone who dared defy the norms of the church. It began subtly, as most things do in a world shaped by fear. A neighbor accused Thomas of questioning the teachings of the church. This was enough for the Inquisitors to take notice. Soon, Thomas found himself summoned to answer for his thoughts he hadn't even realized were dangerous. He had questioned a sermon on the nature of sin, suggesting that it seemed too focused on punishment rather than compassion. In the context of the time, this was no small matter. His words were seen not as a personal reflection, but as an attack on the very fabric of the church's control over its followers. Before he could even make sense of the accusations, he was arrested. The arrest wasn't what terrified Thomas the most. It was the process that followed. He wasn't taken directly to trial. Instead, he was placed in a dark cell for days, allowed no contact with his family. His children's faces were the last thing he saw as he was led away, and the thought of not returning to them was what ate at him every moment. The trial, when it came, was a formality. The questions were already settled, and the outcome was preordained. The Inquisition did not seek the truth. It sought conformity, submission to the will of the church. Thomas's trial was little more than a public show of power. The moment he was accused, his fate was sealed. No defense would save him. The most he could hope for was to survive long enough to confess, to submit, and to beg for mercy. And so, with the relentless pain of the rack, the constant fear of what might come next, Thomas did what so many before him had done. He confessed. But his confession wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an act of survival. He said what he thought the Inquisitors wanted to hear, hoping beyond hope that they might show mercy. But mercy was a luxury the Inquisition could not afford. His life ended in the public square, his body burned in front of the village, a warning to others who might dare think for themselves. The true tragedy of Thomas's story is not simply that he was burned at the stake, but that his community, the very people who had known him for years, watched as he was consumed by flames, their silence complicit in the horror. The community had been warped by fear, conditioned to see any dissent as a threat. They were not evil people. They were simply products of a system that had taught them to mistrust one another, to fear their own thoughts, and to turn in anyone who seemed even slightly different. In the end, Thomas's death was not just his own. It was the death of something far greater: trust. The Inquisition had succeeded in destroying the most basic human connection, the ability to trust one another. This was the true legacy of the Inquisition, not just the physical deaths, but the deaths of relationships, the destruction of communities, and the creation of a world where loyalty was based on survival rather than shared values. The Inquisition's most devastating power was its ability to make people turn on each other, to shatter the trust that had once been the foundation of social life. It was not just the authorities who were responsible for the suffering. It was the very people who had been trained to see heresy in their neighbors, to report their suspicions, and to live in constant fear of being next. And yet, even in the shadow of this pervasive terror, there were moments of quiet resistance, of courage in the face of insurmountable odds. While the Inquisition was strong, it could not completely extinguish the spirit of defiance. Consider the story of the women in the small town of Saint-Michel, a town notorious for its fervent adherence to the Church's teachings. These women, though they lived under the constant threat of accusation, found ways to resist, though they did so in the most subtle of ways. They would gather in secret behind closed doors, to speak of ideas that were forbidden, to share books that were banned, and to discuss what they knew to be true, ideas about the world, about the nature of God, about the human spirit. Their resistance was not overt. They did not march in the streets or speak out against the authorities. They simply kept alive the knowledge of the past, the wisdom that had been suppressed. And in doing so, they planted the seeds of change. Over time, these women passed down their knowledge to their children to their grandchildren. The whispers of defiance, though silent, were nonetheless powerful. They ensured that the flame of intellectual freedom would never be completely extinguished. But these moments of rebellion were rare, and they came at a high cost. The consequences of defying the Inquisition were severe, and the risks were almost always too great. For every act of resistance, there were countless others who were silenced, whose voices were lost forever. But it was the quiet acts of defiance, the preservation of knowledge, the refusal to accept the world as the Inquisition defined it, that would ultimately pave the way for the change that would come centuries later. The seeds of the Enlightenment were sown in the dark, in the quiet spaces where the Inquisition could not reach. The legacy of the Inquisition is a complex one, filled with both tragedy and resilience. It is a reminder of the dangers of absolute power, of the way fear and suspicion can be weaponized to control entire populations. But it is also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the quiet acts of rebellion that refuse to be silenced, to the unwavering belief in the power of knowledge and freedom. The Inquisition may have crushed many lives, but it could not crush the thirst for truth. And in the end, it was this thirst, this desire for knowledge and freedom, that would eventually triumph. The Inquisition, for all its power, could not destroy the human spirit's capacity for defiance. The grip of the Inquisition was not solely confined to the flames of public executions, nor to the instruments of torture that ravaged the bodies of the accused. It went far deeper, into the psyche of society itself, spreading its tendrils into the heart of the human spirit. What the Inquisition sought to control wasn't just behavior or belief. It sought to dominate the very essence of human existence, to shape thoughts and desires, and to crush the natural impulses of freedom and curiosity. It wasn't simply a war against those who resisted the Church's teachings. It was a war against the very human need to think independently, to ask questions, and to wonder. As we delve deeper into the societal mechanisms that enabled such an oppressive regime to take root, we begin to see that the true power of the Inquisition lay not just in the fear it instilled, but in the way it rewrote the fundamental rules of human connection. Families, friendships, communities, once vital, living entities, were reduced to fragile, broken structures, shattered by suspicion and distrust. The Inquisition turned the very core of social relationships into weapons, tools for manipulating and controlling the masses. Those who were once close, neighbors, family members, and lifelong friends, became potential informants. Everyone became a possible threat, an accuser, or a victim. Consider the small village of Roussillon, nestled in the rugged hills of southern France. For generations, it had been a place of simple lives and shared burdens. People knew one another intimately, families intertwined, stories passed down, laughter shared over dinner tables, and disagreements settled in the communal square. But the Inquisition cast its dark shadow across Roussillon, and with it came an atmosphere of fear so suffocating that the village began to rot from the inside. It started with whispers, small, innocuous exchanges between a few villagers. Someone had overheard an argument between a husband and wife, where the wife had casually remarked, "Why would God allow such suffering in the world? Could it not be a mistake of men?" This small seed of doubt planted in the mind of a neighbor grew into a storm of suspicion. The church, ever vigilant for signs of heresy, wasted no time in acting. A rumor spread through Roussillon the woman was questioning the will of God, challenging divine authority. It didn't take much for the rumor to transform into something far more sinister, an accusation of witchcraft. The woman, once known for her kindness and generosity, was now considered a threat. Her family was torn apart by the accusations, and the neighbors, once her closest friends, began to distance themselves. The Inquisition's response was swift. The woman was arrested, her trial conducted in secret, and she was forced to confess under duress. Her confession, coerced and full of falsehoods, sealed her fate. She was publicly executed in the village square, her life snuffed out in a grotesque display of power. But the true horror of the event wasn't just in her death. It was in the transformation of the village. Her neighbors, her friends, and even her own family had been so consumed by the fear of being next that they had allowed her to be condemned without question. The bonds of trust, so carefully cultivated over years, were shattered in an instant. This story is not unique. It echoes throughout the many communities affected by the Inquisition. Every time an accusation was made, a person was arrested, tortured, or executed, a part of the social fabric tore. Trust was no longer a given. It was something to be feared, something that could easily be manipulated by the authorities. People learned quickly that in a world where anyone could be an enemy, it was safest to stay silent, to keep their thoughts to themselves, and to turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. The Inquisition didn't just suppress heresy, it suppressed human connection. One of the most insidious aspects of the Inquisition was its ability to make betrayal feel necessary. People began to believe that in order to survive, they had to protect themselves at any cost, even if it meant turning against their own. Children reported their parents, spouses denounced each other, neighbors who had once shared meals and stories now avoided each other, unsure of who could be trusted. The Inquisition had created a culture of mistrust that turned every relationship into a potential risk. It wasn't just about saving one's own life, it was about surviving within a society that demanded compliance. Take the story of a young boy, Philippe, who witnessed his own father being dragged away by the Inquisitors. His father had been accused of teaching forbidden ideas to local children, ideas that challenged the church's view of the world. Philippe's father, a humble schoolteacher, had always believed in the power of education, in the pursuit of knowledge, and in the idea that questioning could lead to a better world. But in the eyes of the Inquisition, this was heresy. The day Philippe saw his father arrested was the day his childhood died. In the days that followed, Philippe's mind was torn between love for his father and fear for his own survival. His father had always encouraged him to think for himself, to ask questions and seek answers. But in this new world, such thinking was a death sentence. Philippe knew that if he didn't conform, if he didn't speak the right words, he would face the same fate as his father. But the fear of losing his family, of being cast out, was more immediate. And so, when the Inquisitors came to him and asked him what his father had said to him, he betrayed the very man who had raised him. Philippe's father was executed, and Philippe lived the rest of his life haunted by the memory of that betrayal. In the eyes of the authorities, Philippe had done what was necessary to save himself. But in his own heart, the wound was deeper than any torture. The Inquisition had successfully cultivated a society in which survival meant self-preservation at the expense of others. It had turned love, loyalty, and friendship into liabilities. Those who resisted the Inquisition didn't just face the threat of death, they faced the loss of their humanity. The Inquisition had succeeded in turning individuals into mere tools of conformity, stripped of the ability to care for one another, to trust one another, and to live freely. But despite the pervasive fear, there were still those who resisted, those who found ways to fight back against this dark force. They resisted not in grand displays of power, but in small, quiet ways, by passing along secret knowledge, by helping those who had been accused of heresy, by refusing to bow to the pressure of conformity. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not wield swords or lead rebellions. Instead, they lived their lives in defiance of the forces that sought to control them, quietly pushing back against the tides of fear that threatened to engulf them. One such individual was Jeanne, a woman from a small town in Spain who had been raised in a family with deep ties to the church. Her father was a devout man, a member of the local clergy, and her family had always been strong supporters of the Inquisition. But Jeanne, as she grew older, began to see the world through a different lens. She questioned the teachings she had been raised with and began to read books that were considered forbidden by the church. She sought out those who had been accused of heresy, offering them refuge, even at great risk to herself. In the face of the Inquisition's power, Jeanne knew that any action she took could lead to her execution, but she refused to live in fear. She helped those who needed it, even when it meant putting her own life on the line. For years, she lived in secret, a quiet but powerful symbol of defiance in a world that sought to control every aspect of her life. When the Inquisition came for her, they found nothing but a woman who had quietly and steadfastly refused to conform to their will. They could not break her, and in the end, they had to retreat, knowing that they could not defeat her spirit. Jeanne's legacy, though small, would endure. Her resistance was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of the individual to stand up, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. The Inquisition may have shaped a world of fear, but it could not extinguish the spark of rebellion that lay in the hearts of those who refused to submit. And though the Inquisition's power seemed absolute, history has proven that even the darkest forces can be overcome by the unyielding strength of the human spirit. The story of Jean, of Philippe, of countless others who resisted in the quietest of ways, serves as a powerful reminder that the fight for freedom, for truth, and for justice is never truly over. Even in the darkest of times, there is always a spark that refuses to be extinguished. The Inquisition, with its wide-reaching power and terrifying precision, is one of the darkest chapters in human history. Its legacy is built not just on the bodies of the executed or the souls tortured into submission, but on the deep psychological scars that were left behind. As the system of control and terror spread throughout Europe, it created an environment where every part of life, thought, speech, action, became dangerous. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Inquisition was its ability to change the very nature of society. It didn't just punish the individual, it poisoned communities, families, and entire cultures, leaving them forever haunted by the shadow of fear. In a world where an accusation could lead to arrest, torture, and execution, the concept of trust became fragile. The Inquisition didn't just separate the guilty from the innocent, it transformed every relationship into a potential battlefield. Friends, neighbors, and even family members became threats, and the smallest slip of the tongue could lead to betrayal. The social fabric was torn apart as people began to view each other with suspicion. No one knew who could be trusted, no one knew who would betray them, and the paranoia that spread was as suffocating as the physical pain inflicted by the torturers. The trust that once formed the bedrock of society was no longer a guarantee. It was now something fragile, easily shattered. Consider the case of a man named Jean, a simple merchant living in a small town in southern France. Jean had always been a respected member of his community. His shop was a cornerstone of the village, and he was known for his generosity, often giving to the poor and helping the sick. But one day, a small, seemingly insignificant event changed everything. Jean had a disagreement with a priest over a minor religious matter. The priest, a staunch supporter of the Inquisition, took offense to Jean's objections and, feeling slighted, reported him. It was a simple accusation, rooted not in any serious crime, but in the priest's own personal vendetta. The moment the accusation was made, Jean's life unraveled. His neighbors, once his friends, began to avoid him. His shop, once a place of community and commerce, became a place of suspicion. People began whispering behind his back, wondering if he was guilty of the crime the priest had accused him of. No one dared speak to him directly. His customers stopped coming. His family began to distance themselves. The psychological toll of the Inquisition wasn't just in the physical torture. It was in the isolation, the abandonment, the slow erosion of everything that once defined him. Jean's mind began to fray as he wondered who would betray him next. Who would turn him in for the slightest hint of wrongdoing? When the Inquisitors arrived, Jean was subjected to the brutal interrogation that so many others had faced before him. He was tortured, beaten, and forced to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. The mere act of questioning the church, of not submitting entirely to its will, was seen as a crime. Jean, broken and desperate, confessed. His confession, though false, was enough to seal his fate. He was executed, but what lingered far longer than the memory of his death was the poison that had spread through the community. The village that had once been a place of mutual support and trust became fractured. The bonds that had once tied people together, trust, friendship, loyalty, had been torn apart, replaced by suspicion and fear. This is the true legacy of the Inquisition, the destruction of social cohesion, the turning of communities into battlegrounds of distrust. It didn't just crush individual lives, it warped entire societies, leaving them forever scarred. People learned to live in fear of each other. The simple act of speaking up, of questioning, became not just dangerous, it became treacherous. In a world where any word could be twisted into an accusation, silence became the safest response. The Inquisition forced people to live in a constant state of fear, where loyalty to the church could only be proven by betraying others. This destruction of trust wasn't confined to villages like Jean's. Across Europe, the effects were widespread. Families were torn apart as accusations of heresy and witchcraft reached even the most intimate spaces. Parents were forced to choose between their children and their own survival. Spouses denounced each other, torn between the love they once shared and the fear of being accused themselves. The Inquisition's reach extended beyond the physical. It permeated the very fabric of relationships, leaving nothing untouched. Even the bond between a mother and child, once sacred, was not immune from suspicion. Children, taught to fear the wrath of the church, were conditioned to turn against their parents, to report their every word, their every action, lest they too be dragged into the nightmare. But even in the face of such overwhelming fear, there were those who refused to submit completely. The very fact that the Inquisition had to resort to such extreme measures to suppress dissent suggests that, despite its overwhelming power, it could not completely erase the desire for freedom and knowledge. While many were crushed under its weight, others fought back, often in the most subtle, quiet ways imaginable. They resisted by continuing to think for themselves, by keeping their faith in the face of overwhelming pressure, and by passing on forbidden knowledge in secret. One such individual was Hélène, a woman from a rural village in France. Hélène had been accused of witchcraft after her healing practices, passed down through generations, were deemed heretical by the local priest. She had spent her life helping her community, tending to the sick, delivering children, and using herbal remedies passed down by her ancestors. But when the Inquisition arrived, she was accused of using her knowledge for dark purposes, of being in league with the devil. Hélène was arrested, and the Inquisitors set to work on her, attempting to extract a confession. The torture was brutal, but Hélène never broke. She refused to confess to something she had not done. Instead, Hélène did what so many others had done before her. She kept her knowledge alive even in the face of death. In secret, she passed on her healing practices to the young women of her village, teaching them how to use herbs and natural remedies, how to care for the sick, all while knowing that the Inquisition would come for them one day. Her resistance was quiet, hidden in the shadows, but it was powerful. And while she was eventually executed, her legacy lived on. The knowledge she passed down, the seeds of rebellion she planted in the hearts of others, continued to grow long after her death. Hélène's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the darkest times, when the Inquisition seemed all-powerful, there were those who refused to let it break them. There were those who fought back in their own quiet way, ensuring that the flame of knowledge and independence could never be fully extinguished. The Inquisition's greatest fear was not just dissent, it was the survival of ideas. It feared the knowledge that it could not control, the ideas that defied its authority, and so it sought to silence these voices through torture and execution. But even as it silenced individuals, it could not kill the ideas they held. In the end, the Inquisition, despite all its power, was never able to completely suppress the human desire for freedom and truth. The legacy of the Inquisition is not only one of cruelty and fear, it is also a story of resistance, of the human spirit's unyielding drive to seek truth, even in the face of death. As we look back at the history of the Inquisition, we see a complex and painful picture. The destruction it wrought was immense, lives lost, communities shattered, ideas suppressed, but it is also a story of survival, of defiance, and of the eventual triumph of the human spirit over tyranny. The Inquisition may have crushed many voices, but it could not completely extinguish the flame of curiosity and the desire for knowledge. And in the end, it is this unbreakable human spirit that prevails.